Yay. All right. So if you are seeing this, it's because perhaps for some reason Miss Rose is not available to read this section of chapter 1 with you, and she would like to make sure that you understand. So I'm going to get started right here at about this spot, which says, that was the summer Dill came to us. Oh, cool. Yeah. So that was the summer Dill came to us. Early one morning, as we were beginning our day's play in the backyard, Jem and I heard something next door in Miss Rachel Haverford's collard patch. We went to the wire fence to see if it was a puppy. Miss Rachel's rat terrier was expecting. Instead, we found someone sitting, looking at us. Sitting down, he wasn't much higher than the collards, so he's very small. A great comparison metaphor there. We stared at him until he spoke. Hey yourself, said Jem pleasantly. I'm Charles Baker Harris. I can read. Consider what that being the first thing you learn about somebody says about that person, right? Consider your themes and maybe mark that for one of them. So what? I said. I just thought you'd like to know I can read. You got anything needs reading? I can do it. How old are you? Asked Jem. 4.5, going on 7. So he's a year older than Scout. Shoot, no wonder then, said Jem, jerking his thumb at me. Scout yonder's been reading ever since she was born, and she ain't even started to school yet. You look right puny for going on 7. Any of you guys have an older sibling who taught you to read before you start school? I know that I taught my brother to read before he entered kindergarten for sure. I'm little but I'm old, he said. Jem brushed his hair back to get a better look. Why don't you come over, Charles Baker Harris? He said, Lord, what a name. It's not any funnier than yours. Aunt Rachel says your name's Jeremy Atticus Finch. Jem scowled. I'm big enough to fit my name, he said. Your name's longer than you are. Bet it's a foot longer. Folks call me Dill, said Dill, struggling under the fence. Do better if you go over the fence instead of under it, I said. Where'd you come from? So you should be getting the sense that Dill is older than Scout, but is not speaking necessarily as mature, right? But just like when we got the whole backstory for Scout's name and where her family comes from, we're going to back up and tell you all about Dill, which is, again, a Southern value. Dill was from Meridian, Mississippi, was spending the summer with his aunt, Miss Rachel, and he would be spending every summer in Macomb from now on. His family was from Macomb County originally. His mother worked for a photographer in Meridian and had entered his picture in a beautiful child contest and won $5. She gave the money to Dill, who went to the picture show 20 times on it. So picture show being like the movies. So consider that a movie today is like $12, $15, even potentially more depending on what time you're seeing it, unless you're seeing it on Tuesday, right? So to go, 20 different times on $5 is pretty crazy. Don't have any picture shows here. Macomb's a teeny tiny town, except the Jesus ones in the courthouse sometimes. Ever see anything good? Dill had seen Dracula, a revelation that moved Jem to eye him with the beginnings of respect. Consider what that teaches us about Dill, right? And like Dill's, when you're a child, to have clout or to have like respect might mean seeing certain things on TV, right? Like being the first to see the R-rated movie. But also consider what that tells us about Jem and his maturity. Tell it to us, he said. Dill was a curiosity. He gives me like Donald Duck vibes here. He wore blue linen shorts that buttoned to his shirt. His hair was snow white and stuck to his head like duck fluff. He was a year my senior, but I towered over him. As he told us the old tale, his blue eyes would lighten and darken, his laugh was sudden and happy, he habitually pulled at a cowlick at the center of his forehead. When Dill reduced Dracula to dust, what excellent alliteration, meaning like Dill, told us the whole story like poof, just like the vampire reduced it to dust. And Jem said that the show sounded better than the book. I asked Dill where his father was. You ain't said anything about him. I haven't got one. Is he dead? No. And if he's not dead, you've got one, haven't you? Dill blushed, and Jem told me to hush. Consider what the way that Scout interacts in this conversation, what that teaches us about her as a person as well. Think, her maturity or immaturity. A sure sign that Dill had been studied and found acceptable. Like, sweet, he's in the friend group now. Thereafter, the summer passed in routine contentment. Routine contentment was, now we get a list of all the things that make summer awesome for them. Improving our treehouse that rested between the giant twin chinaberry trees in the backyard. Fussing or arguing with each other. Running over our list of dramas based on the works of 3 long-dead authors, the most famous of which is Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote Tarzan. In this matter, we were lucky to have Dill. He played the character parts formerly thrust upon me, aka he got the least of the good stuff. Like he got to play the bad characters. The ape in Tarzan, Mr. Crabtree in The Rover Boys, Mr. Damon in Tom Swift. Thus, we came to know Dill as a pocket Merlin. Simile or metaphor, mark it. And then what does that comparison teach us about Dill? Do you need to know who Merlin is? Merlin is a magician, a famous magician. So if he's a pocket magician, jot down what that means about who he is, what we're learning about his character. Whose head teemed with eccentric plans, strange longings, and quaint fantasies. Maybe that whole sentence can teach us a little bit about Dill, right? But by the end of August, our repertoire was vapid, meaning like empty, vapor, vapid, from countless reproductions. Like we've done the same stories too many times. And it was then that Dill gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. The Radley place fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and explanations, it drew him as the moon draws water, but drew him no nearer than the light pole in the corner, a safe distance from the Radley gate, where he would stand, his arm around the fat pole, staring and wondering. Take a second and imagine like this little kid standing as close as he possibly can, but hiding sort of safely behind the telephone pole, right? Watching, the spooky house, the Radley place. Speaking of the spooky house, notice how we set up the mood in here, like what we're supposed to see, the atmosphere and the setting of what the Radley place looks like. Mark a couple images. The Radley place jutted into a sharp curve beyond our house. Walking south, one faced its porch. The sidewalk turned and ran beside the lot. The house was low, was once white with a deep front porch and green shutters, but had long ago darkened to the color of the slate gray yard around it. Rain-rotted shingles drooped over the eaves of the veranda. Oak trees kept the sun away. The remains of a picket fence drunkenly guarded the front yard. Consider that the fence, the picket fence, is given the human-like quality and what it might mean that the fence is drunk, what that kind of image should look like, right? It was a swept yard, meaning it was supposed to be a nice-looking yard, a particular style. A swept yard that was never swept, where Johnson grass and rabbit tobacco, aka weeds, grew in abundance. Inside that house lived a malevolent, evil phantom. People said he existed, but Gemini had never seen him. People said he went out at night when the moon was down and peeped in windows. Again, now you should be looking for and noting some details about our malevolent phantom, our ghosty figure, and what they say about him. Some, perhaps people's theme perspective of him. People said he existed, but we'd never seen him. People said he went out at night when the moon was down and peeped in windows. When people's azaleas froze in a cold snap, it was because he had breathed on them. Ooh. Any stealthy small crimes committed in Maycomb were his work. Once the town was terrorized by a series of morbid nocturnal events, meaning morbid being bad or deadly. Nighttime things happened. So here are some of the things that happened. People's chickens and household pets were found mutilated. Gross. Although the culprit was Crazy Addie, who eventually drowned himself in Baker's Eddy, people still looked at the Radley place, unwilling to discard their initial superstitions. So people didn't care that they knew the real story. They still thought, well, maybe the ghost did it. And now for a really important part, which is really part of why I'm making this as a video versus just letting you read. If I hear a single student at any place in this middle school building, if I hear of it in group chats, if I hear of it outside these walls, anywhere in our society where you are using a word other than black person or African American to describe this group of people. Do I need to finish my sentence? We are respectful here. You will never say these words. Capiche? Yeah, I assume you just caposhed. So a black person would not pass the Radley place at night. He would cut across to the sidewalk opposite and whistle as he walked. That's an old school superstition, similar to holding your breath when you walk by, when you drive by a cemetery, or when you're going through a tunnel. If you're whistling, there's always air moving out of your mouth, so the ghosts can't get in. The Maycomb School grounds adjoined the back of the Radley lot. From the Radley chicken yard, tall pecan trees shook the fruit into the backyard. So think like, you should be thinking about The Sandlot if you've seen that movie. If you have not seen the movie The Sandlot, go home and watch the movie. It's so good. But the whole point is they hit the baseball over the fence, and there's a scary monster that lives in that house, so they don't go get the baseball. And finally, one kid is like brave enough to go in. But like the movie's better than that. Go watch the movie, y'all. But that's the whole same thing here. Like when the pecan trees shake their fruit into the schoolyard, no one's going to go eat that. But the nuts lay untouched by the children. Yeah, that line doesn't age well. Radley pecans would kill you. A baseball hit into the Radley yard was a lost ball. No questions asked. The misery of that house began many years before Jem and I were born. The Radleys, welcome anywhere in town, kept to themselves. A predilection or like a way of being that is unforgivable in Maycomb. They did not go to church, Maycomb's principal recreation, but they worshiped at home. If we started off this chapter looking at different Southern values, consider this one right here and some of the other ones that the Radleys are not going to take part in. If all of Southern society goes to church, and they do, it's one of the only reasons that they leave their self-sufficient homesteads, the Maycomb's principal recreation, the thing they all do, the Radleys don't go to church. Mrs. Radley seldom, if ever, crossed the street for a mid-morning coffee break with her neighbors. Again, constant Southern way of being. Mrs. Radley never joined a missionary circle. Again, anti-Southern values. Mr. Radley walked to town at 11:30 every morning and came back promptly at 12, sometimes carrying a brown paper bag that the neighbors assumed carried the family groceries. I never knew how old Mr. Radley made his living. Jem said he bought cotton, a polite term for doing nothing. Consider that if you grew cotton, you did a lot of hard work. So if you just buy it, you weren't doing anything at all. So that's a Southern perspective, a Southern judgment over the fact that however they make their money, they don't see it physically. It's not like physical labor in the way that Southern society values. But Mr. Radley and his wife had lived there with their 2 sons as long as anyone could remember. But the shutters and doors of the Radley house were closed on Sundays. Another thing alien to Maycomb's ways, anti-Southern value. Closed doors means illness and cold weather only. Otherwise, your door was open. Anyone's welcome, especially on Sunday. Of all days, Sunday was the day for formal afternoon visiting. Ladies wore corsets, men wore coats, children wore shoes. But to climb the Radley front steps and call "hey" of a Sunday afternoon as something their neighbors never did. The Radley house had no screen doors. I once asked Atticus if it had ever had any. So if you had a screen door, you could then keep the bugs out but allow people in. So you would leave your door open but your screen door closed. So again, like how come nobody goes there? I once asked Atticus if they ever had any, and Atticus said yes, but it was before I was born. According to neighborhood legend, what follows is the whole the concept that when you gossip about someone, you have a perspective that then colors what other people think of you. So this is the perspectives. That's a theme, you should mark it, of the Radleys. When the younger Radley boy was in his teens, he became acquainted with some of the Cunninghams from Old Sarum. Wee woo, foreshadowing, we will meet the Cunninghams. But here is the local gossip about them. They were an enormous and confusing tribe, domiciled, meaning living, in the northern part of the county. And they formed the nearest thing to a gang that had ever been seen in Maycomb. So like a group of people, you know? Let's see what the gang did. They did little. but enough to be discussed by the town and publicly warned from 3 places, pulpits. A pulpit is like where someone would stand to give a speech. So they're warned away 3 times. They hung around the barber shop, so they, hung around too much. They rode the bus to Abbotsville on Sundays and went to the picture show, so they went to the movies too much. And they attended dances, oh, good Lord, at the county's Riverside Gambling Hell. Because gambling was evil, right? That would be totally anti-God and Christian. It was called the Dewdrop Inn and Fishing Camp, which makes me laugh because, their hotel is also where they go fishing. They experimented with stump hole whiskey. Ooh, they made their own alcohol. I mean, it was just after the prohibition when you weren't allowed to buy alcohol legally. Nobody in Maycomb had nerve enough to tell Mr. Radley that his boy was in with the wrong crowd. Perspective. One night, in an excessive spurt of high spirits, the boys backed around the square in a borrowed flivver, a car, resisted arrest by Maycomb's ancient cop beetle, Mr. Connor, and locked him in the courthouse outhouse. So they locked the cop in the bathroom, and they backed around the square and did donuts or whatever. The town decided something had to be done. Mr. Connor said he knew who each and every one of them was, and he was bound and determined they wouldn't get away with it. So the boys came before the judge on charges of disorderly conduct. Okay. Disturbing the peace. Fine. Assault and battery. Depends on how badly it took to get Mr. Connor in the bathroom. Whatever. And my favorite, using abusive and profane language in the presence and hearing of a female. Meaning they cursed or said bad words in the presence of a lady. Another Southern value. Simply was not done. The judge asked Mr. Connor why he included that last charge. Mr. Connor said they cussed so loud he was sure every lady in Maycomb could hear them. So it wasn't even directly in the presence of a lady. He just threw charges at him because he was so mad. The judge decided, it's also sexist, by the way, if you want to mark some of that, which is prejudice. If we're looking for social injustice, that is a great example of some social injustice that isn't connected to being Black in America at this time. The judge decided to send the boys to the state industrial school, where boys were sometimes sent for no other reason than to provide them with food and decent shelter, meaning they were sent to juvie, but juvie at this time didn't have the same stereotypes as it does now. A lot of times kids simply didn't have enough food to live, so they would get sent to the state juvie school just so that they had food and shelter. So for homeless kids, that's where they would send them. It was no prison and it was no disgrace, but Mr. Radley thought it was. If the judge released Arthur, Mr. Radley would see to it that Arthur gave no further trouble. Knowing that Mr. Radley's word was his bond, the judge was glad to do so. The other boys attended the industrial school and received the best secondary education to be had in the state. So they attended the state, juvie school and got some of the best education possible. One of them eventually worked his way through engineering school at Auburn. However, the doors of the Radley house were closed on weekdays as well as Sundays now, and Mr. Radley's boy was not seen again for 15 years. But there came a day, barely within Jem's memory, when Boo Radley was heard from and was seen by several people, but not by Jem. He said Atticus never talked much about the Radleys. When Jem would question him, Atticus's only answer was for him to mind his own business and let the Radleys mind theirs. They had a right to. But when it happened, Jem and Atticus shook his head and said, Jem said Atticus shook his head and said, So, Arthur Radley is Boo Radley. I want you to mark that because it's going to get confusing. This is another character thing you might want to add. Arthur Radley is Boo Radley. There is also a brother, Nathan. 2 brothers. Nathan, normal, 2 parents, and Boo Radley, who is Arthur, who was locked away after getting caught in some trouble. Jem receives most of his information about Boo Radley from the neighborhood scold, Miss Stephanie Crawford. A scold is a gossip. Miss Stephanie Crawford's entire description is that it's her job to know all the hot goss in the neighborhood and then spill that tea with everyone, including children. Keep in mind, Jem's like 10, and she's gossiping with him about it. Consider if that's immature. She said she knew the whole thing. Well, we'll find out what she's about to say. According to Miss Stephanie, Boo was sitting in the living room, cutting some items from the Make Home Tribune to paste in his scrapbook. His father entered the room. As Mr. Radley passed by, Boo drove the scissors into his parents' leg, pulled them out, wiped them on his pants, and resumed his activities. Again, consider the source of your information and if we trust it. However, this is what the kids believe about this person, and this is why they call him Boo. Mrs. Radley ran screaming into the street that Arthur was killing them all. But when the sheriff arrived, he found Boo still sitting in the living room, cutting up the Tribune. He was 33 years old then. So we are gossiping about a man that is like my age, okay, who apparently stabbed his dad. Apparently. After being locked up for like 15 years. But we don't know what's true. This is all one perspective. Miss Stephanie said that old Mr. Radley said no Radley was going to any asylum or like mental ward, when it was suggested that a season in Tuscaloosa, like maybe putting him away for a little while, might be helpful to Boo. Boo wasn't crazy. He was high-strung at times, according to his father. Maybe Boo was just different, if you catch what I'm saying. It was all right to shut him up, Mr. Radley conceded, but insisted that Boo not be charged with anything. He was not a criminal. The sheriff hadn't the heart to put him in the jail alongside black people, so Boo was locked in the courthouse basement. Consider the injustice there. Like, we can't put him in jail. That's where the black people go. So we'll just lock the crazy man in the basement. That is where I'm going to end off. From here forward, it's up to you to read. Consider that Boo's story is not over, right? That we're going to learn about the passing of Boo's parents and how his brother Nathan takes over in raising him. Chapter 2 will begin, we'll leave sort of the Boo story behind for a little while and teach you more about Scout's first day at school, which does not go so well. So if you have just watched this to the end, keep in mind that your reading assignment for tonight is to finish chapter 1, which is only a couple more pages, and to read all of chapter 2, because it is a good chunk of reading that's happening on your own. I do have the right to quiz you, and I'll warn you, since it is your first time reading To Kill a Mockingbird with me, that I will quiz you next class on the end of chapter 1 and mostly on chapter 2. So thanks for your first edition of Rose Reads To Kill a Mockingbird, the unexpected original, the unexpected beginning trend of, just stop, Miss Rose. Okay, I love you. Bye.